The night Marlena Briggs walked through the iron gates of the Hargrove estate, she had exactly $11 in her coat pocket, a dying child waiting at home, and nothing left to lose. That, she would later understand, was the most dangerous thing a person could be. Dominic Hargrove was not a man who inspired warmth. He inspired silence. The particular, suffocating silence of a room that went still the moment he entered it, suit straightening, glasses lowering, conversations dying mid-sentence like a match pinched between two fingers. At 36, he was the undisputed head of the Hargrove Syndicate, a criminal organization so deeply woven into the fabric of St. Louis that it had become part of the city's architecture, invisible and load-bearing at once. He was broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, with dark green eyes that catalogued everything with the flat efficiency of a surveillance camera. He dressed in custom charcoal wool, wore no jewelry except a single signet ring on his right hand, and spoke in a low baritone that required people to lean in, which was, Dominic knew, entirely intentional. Power was largely a theater of proximity, but beneath the theater, beneath the marble floors and the armed men, and the imported scotch decanting in crystal decanters, Dominic Hargrove carried a secret that had quietly hollowed him out over the past 4 years. A botched ambush on the waterfront docks had nearly killed him. 3 bullets. One that nicked his femoral artery, one that shattered 2 ribs, and one that tore through his lower abdomen with catastrophic precision. The surgeons at the private facility in the Missouri countryside had kept him breathing, but the damage was irreversible. Dominic Hargrove could not father children in the world. He inhabited a world built on bloodlines, succession, and the inherited weight of criminal dynasties. This was not merely a personal grief. It was a structural vulnerability. The old families of the National Syndicate Commission operated on a simple logic. A boss without heirs was a boss without a future. A kingdom with no succession plan was a kingdom in slow collapse, ripe for conquest by hungrier men. The whispers had started within a year of the shooting. Carefully worded, plausibly deniable, but unmistakable. The women from the syndicate families, daughters of capos, nieces of commissioners, women raised from childhood to understand that marriage was a political instrument, had withdrawn from his orbit with polished, gracious efficiency. They attended his charity galas. They accepted his expensive bottles of wine at dinner. They laughed at his rare jokes, but they did not accept his courtships. Marrying a man notorious for his cruelty was a calculated risk that certain ambitious families had historically accepted. Marrying a man who could offer no blood heir was simply bad arithmetic. No family would trade their daughter for a dynasty with no future. Dominic had absorbed this reality, the way he absorbed most painful truths quietly. And then, with increasing coldness, he had stopped extending courtships altogether. He had redirected his focus entirely toward the empire, expanding territory, eliminating threats, and cementing fear as the only legacy he had left to build. He told himself he had made peace with dying alone. He told himself this convincingly enough that he almost believed it. Marlena Briggs had never believed in luck. She believed in 12-hour shifts. She believed in generic brand cereal and layered clothing and the specific arithmetic of which bills to pay late so the lights stayed on. She believed in her son, Caleb, 6 years old, with her brown eyes and his absent father's stubborn chin, and a congenital heart condition that the pediatric cardiologist at the county clinic described with the careful optimism of someone who had learned not to make promises. Marlena was 27. She was 5'4" and carried 260 pounds on a frame that the world had spent considerable energy reminding her was wrong. Her co-workers at the Blue Ribbon Grill on Chestnut Street were kind enough, but the customers were not always so generous. She had learned to absorb cruelty the way a seawall absorbs water consistently, silently, and at a cost that never fully showed on the surface. Her ex, Derek Purcell, had been charming in the specific, exhausting way of men who mistake charm for character. He had lasted 3 years in her life, long enough to give her Caleb and accumulate a gambling debt of $68,000 with the Hargrove Syndicate's lending operation before disappearing from St. Louis entirely. No goodbye. No forwarding address. Just an empty half of the closet and a handwritten note that read, "I'm sorry," in the same looping script he'd used to sign Caleb's first birthday card. The syndicate's collectors found Marlena. 6 weeks later, it was a Wednesday afternoon. The lunch rush had just ended. She was wiping down the counter when 2 men in dark wool coats walked through the diner's glass door. And the air pressure in the room shifted in a way she couldn't explain, but immediately understood. The taller one, thick neck. Knuckles like a paved road, placed both hands flat on the counter and informed her, in the conversational tone of someone discussing a utilities bill, that Derek's debt was now her debt. $68,000. Due within 10 days. If she was short, they would begin collecting in alternate currencies, starting with things she cared about. He looked at the photo of Caleb taped to the register when he said it. Marlena drove home that night with her hands shaking on the steering wheel and Caleb asleep in his booster seat in the back. She sat in the parking lot of their apartment complex for 20 minutes after she turned the engine off, doing the math over and over, arriving at the same answer every time. There was no math that worked. There was no version of $68,000 that she could produce in 10 days. The police were not an option. She knew enough about the way St. Auken. Louis worked to know which precincts had Hargrove men on their payrolls. Her family was in rural Tennessee and barely had enough to cover their own winter heating. There was only one option. It was insane. It was possibly suicidal. She was going to go directly to Dominic Hargrove and ask him, face to face, for mercy. The Hargrove estate sat behind a black iron gate on a private road in Ladue. 12 manicured acres of limestone and symmetry that looked more like a European embassy than a private residence. Marlena arrived at 9:30 on a Thursday night in a borrowed car with a cracked tail light. Wearing her good coat, the one without the frayed cuffs over a waitress uniform she hadn't had time to change out of. The guards at the gate looked at her, the way people looked at something that had wandered into the wrong habitat. She told them she was there about Derek Purcell's debt. She told them she had a proposition. She told them she would sit on the driveway pavement in 30-degree weather until someone took her seriously. And she said all of it in the flat. Exhausted voice of a woman who had already considered every alternative and rejected them. The gate didn't open immediately, but a camera above the guardhouse rotated toward her with a soft mechanical whir. Inside the estate, in a study lined floor to ceiling with legal texts and navigational charts that served no decorative purpose, Dominic Hargrove sat behind a desk the size of a small boat, watching the security feed on a monitor inset into the wall. He watched the woman in the parking lot. He watched the way she wrapped her arms around herself against the cold, but didn't move toward the car. He watched the exact quality of her stillness. He pressed the intercom button. Bring her in. The hallway from the gate to the study was long enough that Marlena had time to reconsider her decision approximately 11 times. The men escorting her were polite in the mechanical way of people who were polite as a professional discipline. Her sneakers squeaked on the polished stone floors. She noticed Renaissance-style oil paintings, real ones, and a chandelier that probably cost more than every car she had ever owned combined. And she thought, abstractly, that she was going to die in a very beautiful building. The study door opened. Dominic Hargrove was standing, not sitting. When she entered, which she hadn't expected, he was taller than she'd imagined from the photographs she'd seen in news articles, broader across the shoulders, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that motion was often just noise. His green eyes moved over her once, completely, and then settled on her face. "Derek Purcell?" he said. "Not a Christian." "Yes," Marlena said. Her voice held. Barely. But it held. "He's gone. I know that makes the debt mine by your rules. I'm not here to argue that. I'm here to ask you what I can do. Practically. That isn't $68,000 I don't have. To make this right. What do you imagine you can offer?" "Labor," she said. "I cook. I clean. I organize. I work a 12-hour shift, 6 days a week without complaint. And I have done that since I was 16 years old. Put me to work. Let me work off what he owes. However long it takes." Dominic looked at her for a long moment. The quality of that look was not the one she'd braced for contemptuous, amused, dismissive. It was something else. Calculating. The gears of a precise and dangerous mind, turning over a problem. "You have a son," he said. The air left her lungs. "Yes." "How old?" "6." She paused. "He has a heart condition." "He's not. He doesn't have a current crisis. But he needs a procedure. A repair. The county clinic has him on a 2-year waiting list for a specialist consult." She had not planned to say that. It came out of its own weight. Dominic turned away from her, walking to the window that looked out over the estate's darkened back garden. He stood there for what felt like a geological era. The commission summit was in 18 days. 4 rival families had formally petitioned to have the Hargrove Syndicate's territorial claims in the Eastern Corridor reviewed code, in commission language, for a power redistribution. The argument they would bring was the same argument they had been sharpening for 2 years. Dominic had no successor, no family, no stabilizing structure. A syndicate without succession was an empire in name only. He could not buy a commission bride. He had tried, through intermediaries, and the answer had been clear. He could not produce an heir biologically. He had accepted that, but he could adopt one, and standing in his study, wrapped in a coat with a small pull at the left shoulder, was a woman with a ready-made child. A catastrophic desperation. And he had watched the security footage carefully, the specific, unbreakable quality of someone who would not run. He turned back around. "I have a different proposition," Dominic said. "Sit down." She didn't sit immediately. That, he noted, was characteristic when he laid out the terms marriage, adoption, debt erasure, medical care for the boy, residence in the estate. He watched her face move through shock, disbelief, and then a rapid, ruthless internal calculation that he found, involuntarily, impressive. "What do you want from me?" privately she asked. And the directness of it, the complete absence of performance, was startling. "Loyalty," he said. "Public presence. You play the part convincingly. In private, we maintain separate lives. You'll have security, resources, and autonomy within the estate's bounds. What I require is your commitment that you will not attempt to take the boy and disappear once his procedure is complete. And if I do, then the debt returns. In full. With interest. And the consequences are not ones I'll describe further. Marlena looked at the window, then back at him. His name is Caleb. She said, not the boy. If we're doing this, you say his name. Dominic was quiet for a moment. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in his expression. Caleb, he said, my terms stand. Then I accept. She said, but I want his surgery scheduled before the wedding. He almost smiled. He didn't. Quite. But almost. Done. He said, the surgery happened first. As promised, Dominic arranged for Caleb to be seen by Dr. Priya Anand at the Brookfield Children's Heart Institute, the top pediatric cardiac surgeon in the Midwest, within 72 hours of their agreement. The procedure lasted 4 hours. Dominic paid the bill before it was itemized. When Marlena sat in the waiting room in the same coat she'd worn to his gate, Dominic did not join her. But a member of his household staff arrived 40 minutes into the wait with coffee. A meal she hadn't ordered, but found she needed, and the quiet, wordless message that she was not entirely alone. She filed that away without comment. The wedding was a courthouse ceremony on a gray Tuesday morning, 11 days before the commission summit. No flowers, no music, a notary, 2 witnesses who worked for Dominic's legal team, and Caleb, who had been told they were moving somewhere nicer and had accepted this with the uncritical adaptability of a child who had spent his whole life trusting his mother to make hard things work out. When the fleet of black vehicles pulled up to the estate that evening, Caleb pressed his face against the window and said, in a voice of pure reverence, "Mom, is that a castle?" "Something like that," Marlena said, her hand tight around his. Dominic met them in the foyer. He was in a dark suit. His tie loosened, a detail that surprised her. She would not have expected loosened anything. When Caleb stepped through the front door, clutching a stuffed dog named Captain with both arms, Dominic crouched down onto one knee on the marble floor and held out his hand. "I'm Dominic," he said. "Welcome home." Caleb shook his hand with enormous seriousness and said, "I like your stares." Something happened in Dominic's face that Marlena couldn't fully interpret. She tucked it away with the coffee and the meal and the almost smile. The adjustment was not seamless. It was not meant to be. The other women in Dominic's orbit, wives and daughters of capos and commission members, women who spent their Tuesday afternoons at private gyms and their Thursday evenings at boutique shopping services, were a particular variety of polished that Marlena had no vocabulary for. They were thin with the specific discipline of people who had decided long ago that hunger was a power statement. They wore designers she recognized only because she'd once seen their tags on a second-hand rack. They were not overtly cruel. They were something more efficient than that. They were excluding, in the way of a room, with no chairs for a certain kind of person. Marlena felt it. She felt it in the slight recalibration of conversations when she entered them, in the way eyes moved over her, the way a camera adjusts focus. She was 260 pounds, and she had thrift store heels, and she was the wife of the most dangerous man in 4 states. And neither of those last facts seemed to compensate for the first in the mathematics of that particular world. The night before the commission summit dinner at the Hotel Grandeur on Forsyth Boulevard, She was standing in the walk-in closet of the suite that was technically hers, staring at a rack of gowns that Dominic's wardrobe consultant had sent over, cycling through a familiar, exhausting inventory of all the ways her body was wrong for every single one of them. She had one halfway unzipped when Dominic appeared in the doorway. She didn't hear him approach. She turned and found him standing there, watching her, and the instinct to apologize for existing in this room hit her like a reflex she hated having. He walked to her without asking permission and placed both hands gently over hers on the stuck zipper, guiding them away. "Stop," he said quietly. "I can't do this," she said, and her voice cracked slightly, which she resented. "I know what they're going to see when I walk in there. I know what they're going to say about you, about your judgment, about Marlena." His voice was low, deliberate, with a weight to it that had nothing to do with command. He turned her gently toward the full-length mirror. He stood behind her, his hands resting on her waist not to constrain, but with a solidity that felt impossibly like being held. "I spent 5 years surrounded by women who were performing smallness," he said, starving themselves into the outline of what someone else decided was impressive. "And every single one of them left when they found out I couldn't give them the air they needed. Not one of them stayed." He paused. "You walked through my gate with $11 and a dying kid and asked me for a deal. You told me to use your son's name. You made surgery a condition of the wedding." His jaw shifted. "Wear what fits you, not what fits their expectations of you." Marlena looked at herself in the mirror for a long, quiet moment. She wore a deep burgundy gown the next evening, long-sleeved, floor-length, cut to accommodate and not apologize for every curve she carried. Her hair was up. She wore small gold earrings that had been her grandmother's. When she walked into the Hotel Grandeur ballroom on Dominic Hargrove's arm, the room did what rooms did around him. It went still. But this time, the stillness had a different quality. She felt it land on her like light, and she did not look down. The summit was tense in the way of formal events that are proxies for violence. Dominic moved through the room with his usual predatory ease, Marlena at his side, and she matched his pace and his composure better than either of them had reason to expect. Near the bar, they were intercepted by Garrett Sloan, a commission member from the Atlanta families, widely understood to be the architect of the campaign to strip Dominic's eastern territories. Sloan was 60, well-dressed, with the practiced bonhomie of a man who had learned to deliver contempt in a pleasant voice. Sloan looked at Marlena with the theatrical, exaggerated appraisal of someone performing an inspection. He turned to Dominic. "Hargrove," he said warmly, "I see you've solved your image problem." His eyes moved over Marlena again. "Tell me, did you hold auditions? Or was this a casting decision based on availability?" The ballroom did not stop, but the people nearest to them did. Marlena felt the heat rise in her face. The old instinct, the 27 years of training in how to shrink, how to absorb, how to become small and forgettable when the world aimed itself at her, rose up in her chest like a tide. Dominic did not raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He didn't reach for anything on the nearby table. He simply looked at Garrett Sloan with the flat, complete attention of a man who has decided what comes next and is merely placing the last item on a shelf before he closes the cabinet. "My wife," Dominic said quietly, "is the woman who renegotiated her terms with me before she agreed to anything, including a surgical condition for her son that I met within 72 hours. He paused. "She is the mother of my heir." She is the reason the Commission will have nothing to say about the Hargrove succession after tonight." He took one step towards Sloane. "And if I hear the specific tone you just used again in this room, or any other, I will retire you from the Commission and everything attached to it. Garrett. Am I using the right name?" Sloane's practiced warmth had exited his face. He nodded once, tightly, and removed himself from the conversation. Dominic placed his hand at the small of Marlena's back and said, "Are you all right?" She exhaled. "Yes," she said, and then, quietly, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. It was accurate. The danger that followed was not from the Commission. It came from Derek Purcell, who had been watching from a distance, nursing a grudge and a new debt with one of Sloane's lieutenants. He had seen what Marlena had built from his wreckage. He had decided, with the logic of a man who mistakes blame for power, that he was owed something. Sloane's man offered him $120,000 and a relocation package in exchange for one piece of intelligence, the code to the estate's rear service entrance, which Derek had once watched Marlena enter using a passcode she'd been given during a sanctioned estate visit early in their arrangement on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the summit. A February ice storm was moving through St. Louis. Dominic was downtown at a port facility, managing a logistics issue with a shipping contract. The estate's night security was running a reduced roster due to a stomach illness that had moved through half the team that week. Marlena was in the kitchen, heating milk for Caleb, who couldn't sleep because of the storm. She was wearing an oversized flannel shirt and old jeans, and she was reading a paperback propped against the sugar canister. And she realized later, genuinely content in a way she hadn't been in years. She heard the guard outside the kitchen stop moving, not take a break. Stop. With the specific quality of absence rather than stillness, the rear door opened. Derek walked in with the rain still on his coat, and 3 men behind him who did not work for anyone she recognized. He was holding a pistol he clearly wasn't comfortable with, which somehow made it more frightening. Not less. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has rehearsed what he's going to say. "Hey, Lainey," he said. Derek had called her Lainey. She had always hated it. "You're looking comfortable, domestic, funny. What desperation buys." "Derek," she said. "I need the kid," he said. "Sloane wants him. You hand him over. This is clean." Hargrove finds out in the morning. 27 years of learned smallness. 260 pounds of a woman who had already decided, our ounce, in a courthouse on a grey Tuesday, that she was done making the wrong choices out of fear. "No," she said. Her hand found the cast-iron skillet on the stovetop beside her, a 10-inch lodge, heavy enough to anchor a small boat before she had consciously decided to reach for it. Derek took a step toward the hallway. She moved faster than he'd calculated. The skillet connected with the left side of his head with a sound she felt in her back teeth. He went down hard, the pistol skittering across the tile. And before the 3 men behind him had fully processed what had happened, the front doors of the estate blew open. Dominic Hargrove had been 12 minutes away when his phone rang with the estate's silent alarm. He had driven at speeds that were not legal through an ice storm, without once considering any alternative. What happened in the foyer, in the following 4 minutes, was brief, complete, and devastating in the way of things Dominic Hargrove did when the thing he was protecting mattered more than restraint. When the noise stopped, Derek was alive, which was more than could be said for the composure he'd arrived with. He was dragged by two of Dominic's men into a vehicle that pulled silently out of the estate's front gate. Derek Purcell was not seen in St. Louis, or anywhere else that anyone later confirmed. Again, Dominic found Marlena in the kitchen doorway, both arms wrapped around Caleb, one hand over his eyes. He crossed the room. He dropped to his knees on the kitchen tile, arms coming around both of them, his face pressing into Marlena's shoulder. She felt the tension move through him, the specific, shuddering release of a man who has held himself at maximum compression for a very long time and has finally found a reason to let go. "I've got you," he said. His voice was not the one he used in boardrooms or ballrooms. It was something raw and more real. And she understood in that moment that she had been wrong about one thing since the beginning. This had not been a performance. Neither of them had been performing for quite some time. Later, after Caleb was asleep and the estate had returned to its particular quiet, they sat together in the study. The ice storm was still moving outside the windows. The Scotch decanter was on the desk, untouched. "I married you for the commission," Dominic said. He was looking at his hands, which were scarred across the knuckles in the specific pattern of a man who had solved problems with them for 20 years. "I thought I was past needing anything that was real. I thought that if I couldn't have what the bloodline families had, I would take what was available and make it functional." He looked up. "I was wrong." Marlena watched him. "I'm not easy," she said. "I have a kid who has opinions about everything and a habit of taking in stray animals. And I will absolutely argue with you about decisions I think are wrong." "I know," he said. "I'm counting on it." She leaned over and kissed him. And it tasted like the end of something long and difficult, and the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. And she thought, that was probably right. In the end, Dominic Hargrove found what his enemies had always insisted he couldn't have: a succession, an heir, a family, not the kind that was arranged and blood certified and approved by old men in expensive suits around a commission table. The kind that was built in a courthouse on a grey Tuesday, and in a hospital waiting room with bad coffee, and in a kitchen at midnight with a cast-iron skillet, and a mother who had already decided what she was willing to fight for, Marlena Briggs, who society had catalogued as too heavy, too poor, and too unremarkable to matter, turned out to be the one thing a powerful man had never encountered before. Someone who didn't need his power to feel safe. Someone who had already decided she was enough. Caleb Hargrove grew up with his mother's stubbornness and his father's precision, running across the lawns of an estate that had learned, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, how to feel like a home, and the iron gates that had once kept the world out began, over time, to simply mark the boundary of something worth protecting.